All right, this video is for Tale of Two Cities, book 19, well, book 2, sorry, chapter 19 through 26. You're reading from this week. And so you've already read it, or you're reading it in sections and watching the video in sections. Either way is fine. However helps you and serves you best. This video really is to help you just kind of get a solid understanding of what's going on in each chapter so that when you can come to class next Thursday, you can ask lots of questions. Anything that jumps out at you or connections that you make. So starting with chapter 19, here's a picture on the screen of Dr. Manette and Mr. Lorry. And if you remember in the last chapter where we left off, or not Mr. Lorry, Dr. Manette, he had a relapse and he spent after Charles Darnay and Lucy are married and then they're off on their honeymoon, he goes into his old habits and he doesn't recognize Miss Pross and he doesn't recognize Mr. Lorry and he is making shoes again like an old prisoner, if you recall that. So Lorry spends all this time by his bedside and Dickens is painting a picture of sacrifice. What a good friend to devote his time and energy and resources to help Dr. Manette. Lori earlier remarked about Miss Pross on page 72, so quite a while ago. This wonderful quote, it's so beautiful, I think. So Lori is talking about Miss Pross, and he says, he knew enough of the world to know that there is nothing better in it better than the faithful service of the heart. So rendered and so free from any mercenary taint, he had such an exalted respect for it that in the retributive arrangements made by his own mind, we all make such arrangements more or less, he stationed Miss Pross much nearer to the lower angels than many ladies immeasurably better got up, both by nature and art, who had balances at Tellson's. So he looks at Miss Pross and he sees she's an eccentric woman. She's kind of rough around the edges, but she is so devoted to Lucy. And that quote, I think, is really significant because it shows that he has a respect for Miss Pross. And then he says to Dr. Manette, no man ever can have more desirous in his heart to serve a friend than I am to serve mine. And he opens up this conversation with Dr. Manette, and it's a way of addressing Dr. Manette's regression that is gentle and delicate and kind and gracious. He doesn't come at him like, bro, what happened, man? Where you been? You lost it. He's not coming at him like that. And I guess they wouldn't say bro in 1800s, right? Or the 1700s, which is where this book is set. He uses the backdoor approach. He asks for the doctor's help. Like, I need some help in understanding my friend's situation. Their conversation is very telling. Manette reveals that there is something very strong, something very alarming attached to his experience, right? So something must have triggered him. And we use that word trigger, I guess, now a lot today. He was triggered. Something happened that caused him to regress and go back into his old ways. And this conversation is very delicate. I hope you picked up on the fact that Mr. Lorry is saying, I need some help for my friend. And Dr. Manette is giving him counsel, but they both know what they're really talking about. Dr. Manette is aware that at first, I think he wakes up and he thinks it's just the next day, right? And it's been 9 days. But then eventually he gets it. And he says this at the bottom of 154, you spoke of his daughter. Does his daughter know of the relapse? And Lorry says, no, it has been kept from her, and I hope will always be kept from her. It is known only to myself and to one other who may be trusted. Let's see. An interesting turn happens at the end of the chapter. Hopefully you picked up on this. Mr. Lorry remarks, still under the assumption that they're talking about his friend, he says that perhaps the tools that my friend used should be disposed of. Of course, he's talking about the shoemaking materials, right? The bench, the tools. And Manette treats them as if they are an old companion. They're an old friend. What would he do if he were to regress and those tools weren't there? In some way, these tools and this shoe bench is a comfort to him. And even though they've been a reminder, right, of his imprisonment, they do. I mean, he was in prison for 18 years, and this is what he did. He kind of created a new identity by in the trauma by working on shoes and making shoes. And the end, I love the end of the chapter. It's just hilarious. Well, I don't know if it's hilarious. Maybe that's not the right word. But Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, with the permission of Dr. Manette to destroy the tools and the bench, just the way Dickens writes this, I think it's worth noting. There, with closed doors and a mysterious and guilty manner, Mr. Lorry hacked the shoemaker's bench to pieces, while Miss Pross held the candle as if she were assisting at a murder. Oh, that is great. For which, indeed, in her grimness, she was no unsuitable figure. The burning of the body, previously reduced to pieces convenient for that purpose, was commenced without delay in the kitchen fire, and the tools, shoes, and leather were buried in the garden. So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds that Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and the removal of its traces, almost felt and almost looked like accomplices in a horrible crime. Great description by Dickens there. They're such good people, right? Miss Pross and Mr. Lorry. And they're destroying this shoe bench and the tools out of their love for Dr. Manette. But it's such a horrific act that they feel like they're criminals or involved in a murder. I love that. It's great. Okay. Here's a picture. I've got a picture. Remember, I'm bad at advancing slides. Okay, there they are. It's kind of fuzzy. Yeah, there we go. Miss Pross holding the candle. Mr. Lorry chopping away at the shoe bench. Okay, book 2, chapter 20, is called A Plea. And we get another picture of Sydney Carton here in this chapter. So now that Lucy and Darnay are married, how is Carton going to fit into this picture? Right? He's come and he's shared his heart with Lucy already. And we know he's already been of service to Charles Darnay. He was the one that kind of tipped the scales for him in terms of the trial at the beginning of the book, right? So in this chapter, he has a conversation with Darnay, and he says, top of 159, I wish we might be friends. So he makes this gesture. He reaches out, which is kind of out of character for him, and he asks, can I visit? And he not in an overbearing way, but he's like, every so often, can I just come and visit? And Darnay kind of sees him as an oddity, right? And even later in talking, after Carton leaves, he's talking to the others, and he says, on 160, that he's a man of, he spoke of Sydney Carton as a problem of carelessness and recklessness. Well, he doesn't know what Lucy knows. Lucy has seen his heart, and she, out of her goodness, is going to defend Sydney Carton. And so later that evening, she asks something of Darnay. And she says to him, her husband, I think, Charles, poor Mr. Carton deserves more consideration and respect than you expressed for him tonight. And he's a bit shocked. And she says of Carton, I am sure that he is capable of good things, gentle things, even magnanimous things. I love that word. We'll talk about that maybe in a minute here. But so Carton is described by Dickens as someone who had a look of fidelity about him. You see that in the beginning of chapter 20. And fidelity means faithfulness, loyal, someone who would keep a promise. And that's the kind of person I want in my corner, right? And even though he has this reputation that he's kind of just a ne'er-do-well, he asks, can I please be friends? Can I stop by your house and just enjoy your family? Um, and he's going to be faithful. We see that. Dickens kind of gives us that idea. And then you get this foreshadowing a little bit that Lucy sees him as somebody who is capable of magnanimous things. That is a fantastic word. He basically says, you've got a friend in me. And I like that about him, Sidney Carton. Oh, here we go. See, I'm not good at advancing slides. I would ask you to believe that he has a heart very, very seldom reveals, and there are deep wounds in it, my dear. I have seen it bleeding. All right, so what is magnanimous? It means generous, open-handed, and this is my favorite word that describes magnanimous, great-hearted. Sidney Carton is great-hearted, chivalrous, and unselfish. Those are all words that go with magnanimous. And so what are we going to just tuck that away about Sidney Carton? On the outside, he does not look like these things, but Lucy sees it in him. Book 2, chapter 21. So this is very much, it's called Echoing Footsteps. And that kind of reminds us of an earlier chapter that we read, right? It sounds familiar. Remember that chapter of hundreds of people? And Miss Pross is so worried about all the people, hundreds and hundreds. She exaggerates. She's prone to exaggeration. Hundreds of people. And we get this image of footsteps and echoes, and something is coming. And so he does it again, echoing footsteps. And in this chapter, a lot of time is going to pass. And it happens very quickly. And sometimes first readers even miss a little bit of what's going on in chapter 21. Lucy and Charles Darnay have children. They have a daughter. And it happens in like the span of one paragraph. And he talks about how she's the golden thread binding them all together. Her happy influence is weaving through their lives. And so they have this young daughter, and then kind of, I don't know if it's cryptic, but some people don't get it the first time. They have a little boy, and he's old enough to speak, but he is going to die. And it does happen. It passes really quickly. Okay. So they have a little boy and he passes, and we get little snippets about their family life, just a little bit. And it says of Sidney Carton on 163, no man ever really loved a woman, lost her, and knew her with a blameless, though an unchanged mind. That phrase is really interesting. A blameless mind, an unchanged mind. He still loves her. He still sees her as the last dream of his soul, but he's blameless. That's interesting. That tells me that he has set aside his pursuit of her. He doesn't see her in that way. She's married to Charles Darnay. And so he has a great love for their whole family because of his care for her. And then a little bit of snippet about the little boy and the girl. They kind of love Sidney Carton. They think he's a neat guy. Poor Carton, kiss him for me, says the little boy. And we get this little snippet that he dies. I'm very sorry to leave you both and to leave my pretty sister, but I am called and I must go. All right. Let's see. What else I want to give you about this? Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second. This chapter is doing something else, just like hundreds of people. You get this kind of foreshadowing. So it's really important to see all this language that's happening in this chapter as it progresses. You get a great storm in France with this sea rising. So if you think metaphorically, this is not a literal sea rising. It's a metaphor for the tumult, the chaos, and the rage that is building around the peasants. And it's just all over the pages here. Lightning, great storm, rumbling, sea rising. Again, lightning, whirlpool of boiling waters. I mean, he's just hitting you over the head. with all kinds of images that are pretentious. Lori remarks that things are so frantic in Paris that it's almost like a run on the bank. Remember, he works for Tellson's, who has a bank in England, in London, and also a bank in Paris, in France. And so they do business back and forth. And the wealthy aristocrats, with all this turmoil that's happening, are starting to move their belongings or their important papers, their finances from France to England to try to save what they can. And Lori talks about that a little bit. You get that frantic nature. Okay. And then, all right, here's an image of the storming of the Bastille. And Dickens tells us it's mid-July, 1789. This is the brink of the storming of the Bastille. And this is the content here of the rest of the chapter. On 166, it's worth noting this and looking at it. Dickens is just a masterful writer. And the way that he writes kind of gives you, remember we read Charge of the Light Brigade? It's got this rhythm, almost like the Charging Horses. And it's kind of, the rhythm of the poem kind of matches the event. Look at the rhythm here on 166. Deep ditches, double drawbridge, massive stone walls, 8 great towers, cannons, muskets, fire and smoke, through the fire and through the smoke, in the fire and in the smoke, for the sea cast him up against a cannon, and on the instant he became a cannoneer. Defarge of the wine shop works like a manful soldier 2 fierce hours. And it keeps going. There's this very short sentences over and over and over again. Deep ditch, single drawbridge, massive stone wall, 8 great towers, cannon, muskets, fire, and smoke, 1 drawbridge down. Work, comrades. Oh, work, Jacques 1, Jacques 2, Jacques 1,000, Jacques 2,000, Jacques 5 and 20,000, in the name of all the angels or the devils which you prefer, work. Thus Defarge, the wine shop, still at his gun, which had long grown hot. So you get this frenzy, this fury, the storm has risen. It is at its peak. Alarm bells ringing, drums beating, sea raging. And so there's a lot of instability in France, both politically, economically, socially. And the metaphor Dickens here uses of this storm is very appropriate here because the storm has landed in Saint Antoine in Paris. And this storming of the Bastille is like the eye of a storm. The crowd that gathered on that day, they wanted ammunition, gunpowder that was being stored at the Bastille. And the crowd quickly becomes a mob. And we've already encountered mobs a couple times. Remember the wine barrel scene, the funeral procession for Roger Clive. Here is, I guess, an eyewitness observer drew this picture of the storming of the Bastille. So that's it's kind of a, well, it's a good picture. Okay. So note that in this chapter, this is just important to tuck away. Defarge finds Manette's cell, 105 North Tower. Let's talk about that more in class, all right? And maybe the significance of that. Okay, I'm trying to go a little bit faster. My last videos have been long, I understand. There's so much here, and I love talking about it, so I'm sorry. But we'll also talk about it in class, too. So I just want to kind of recap these chapters. In Book 2, Chapter 22, it's titled The Sea Still Rises. And so you're going to see a lot more conflict building. Okay, there's a woman that you meet, Madame Defarge, her friend, is called the Vengeance. During the French Revolution, a lot of names were changed. Names of streets, names of the months, names of, I know that the Cathedral, Notre Dame, was changed from Notre Dame. What was it called? I'm not sure. I'll think of it in a minute, but it had a different name that had to go with the revolution. And so even people would take on these monikers, these identities, these names that would identify them with the revolution. And so it's interesting that Dickens writes of this woman called the Vengeance. I don't want a friend called that. I don't want to meet this lady, the Vengeance. And hopefully you're starting to see a little bit more of a picture develop of who Madame Defarge is. During the French Revolution, there was a sisterhood of knitters for real. Like they would go and sit by the guillotine and knit. Very creepy. And you picked up on this idea that Madame Defarge is knitting, still knitting, but she doesn't see a thing, right? Well, hopefully by now you've understood that she's knitting the names of people. It's her register. It's a way of keeping a list of people she wants to exterminate. And remember, I showed you the picture of the golden thread, and we talked about the fates. And there's really two meanings there. We've got the golden thread, Lucy, holding everything together, but we also have this allusion to mythology where the fates cut your string, right? And so here's Madame Defarge knitting, and I'm just putting that knitting together and the cutting of the strings together. Lots of fate imagery going on. Let's see. The red cap of the revolution. A lot of revolutionaries would wear these red caps, and it would identify them as patriots for the cause. They're revolutionaries. The red cap showed your solidarity with the fight, the revolution. In this book, you get a reference to Old Foulon. I'm not French. It would be Foulon. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not French. Can't say it. I'm a Midwesterner. So Foulon. And he was a real person. Apparently, he was a government minister under Louis XVI, and he made some remarks about the starvation of the people, and reportedly said that they could eat grass. Well, instead of emigrating with the other nobles, as the sea is rising and the tension is starting to happen in France, some of the aristocrats were like, well, we're out of here. We're going to emigrate. We're going to go. We're not going to be immigrants. They're emigrants. They're leaving the country. And they go to various parts around the world where Foulon did not immigrate. In fact, I think he hid for a while. He staged his own death and funeral to make it look like he was dead. But in actuality, about a week after the Bastille fell, in July of 1789, one of his servants betrayed him to the revolutionaries. And in real life, he's lynched, he's hung, his head is placed on a pike, and they literally stuffed grass in his mouth as a reminder of the arrogance and callousness towards people, his comments about the starving. And so you get a picture of that in Tale of Two Cities. That's what's going on. They find Foulon, and he has been lynched. He's been his face has been stuffed with grass, just like the original story. Let's see what else is happening. That's probably pretty good for chapter 22. If you have any questions about that chapter, let's talk about it in class. Okay. So after the storming of the Bastille, shortly after, like end of July, early August in 1789, the peasants, the revolutionaries, they would burn down chateaus in France. And this is called, in history, it's called the Great Fear. And in the early 1800s, so this is chapter 23, fire rises. So it's all these images about the revolution, fire, storm, hold on to those. The sea rising. So in the early 1800s, there's a historian named Thomas Carlyle, and he writes a historical account of the French Revolution. And he describes the oppression of the peasants and the rage that incites them to destroy the home of aristocrats. And many of the homes at this point are abandoned. The owners have fled France, and maybe there's servants left, but they are destroyed. So while Tale of Two Cities is a fictional novel, Dickens is drawing these descriptions from real historical events from Carlyle's history of the French Revolution. Oh, okay, I got it. It was called the Temple of Reason. I told you before that they changed names of things, and they changed the name of the Cathedral of Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason. Kind of doing away with God and glorifying maybe reason, enlightenment thinking. Okay, but in this chapter, Dickens is extending this idea of the metaphor of the storm. So you have impoverished, barren land, you have overtaxed, starving people, right? And all of this is fueling the fire of outrage against a rich and callous aristocracy. So in this chapter, a traveler meets some mender of the roads on the street. And obviously they know something. They have this kind of secret code language. And the traveler talks back and forth and they call each other Jacques. So you know that they're both part of the revolution. And they're calling each other, or they're talking about maybe a location that this traveler is supposed to go to. And you just get little kind of clues. Tonight, you know something's coming. The storm is rising, the sea is rising, and this chapter, the fire is rising. These are all used literally and figuratively in the story. So something's coming, something unpredictable, something destructive, something unavoidable. And sure enough, in this chapter, the Marquis's chateau is set ablaze. And this is the secret work that they were talking about. And then there's something interesting on 178. Let me see if I can find it. It says, yeah, 178. The mender of the roads and 250 particular friends stood with folded arms at the fountain, looking at the pillar of fire in the sky. That's on 178. So they're just watching. They're watching this great pillar. Gabelle is mentioned, and it's important to note him. Gabelle was one of the servants of the Marquis. And he leaves his house and goes up. Well, he doesn't leave his house. He goes up to the roof of his house and he's watching all of this and scared and concerned. They also mentioned that the fire is 40 feet high, but they're all staring at. And that's interesting, right? That's an interesting reference. You see this pillar of fire. Makes me think of like the pillar of fire in the Bible, like an allusion maybe to the Bible. And they're all watching this pillar of fire, but it also kind of alludes to the guillotine, that this 40-foot high, maybe an item of destruction, I guess. Okay, so then the soldiers here are mentioned, and they're not going to help. The soldiers respond, and they say, it must burn. So they're not going to do anything about it. And then we get a little bit of reference to Monsignor, and he just represents the aristocracy here. The name Monsignor is going to represent all of the aristocracy. Okay, chapter 24 has such an interesting chapter. It's called Drawn to the Lodestone Rock. So the title of this chapter is very significant. Dickens is drawing inspiration from a story from Arabian Nights. And the story is about a prince named, Ajib, maybe? Okay, let's just say this, Ajib. And he's sailing his ship. And he comes across a rock. And the rock, so lodestone is a lodestone rock is a rock that's magnetic. So it would draw metal to it. And in this story from Arabian Nights, the ship is heading towards this large rock, and it's a lodestone rock. And it is so powerful, like the magnetic pull from the rock is drawing the ship towards it. Like you just can't avoid being drawn into this vortex, right? And one by one, the nails on the ship, ping, ping, ping. I mean, they just go phew, flying off the ship, and you can kind of see in this rendering here that the nails just attach to this magnetic lodestone rock. And what happens if a ship's nails just ding, 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 right? It's going to fall apart. It's no longer going to hold together, right? It's going to come apart. It's going to sink. It's going to be destroyed. So that's the chapter of the title. Drawn to the lodestone rock. So 3 years go by. It's 1792. The royal court is gone. They've left town. They've either been killed or they've fled. France is a hot mess. The monarchy is abolished, and there's a new sheriff in town. the French Republic is the new government. So several years have gone by, 1792. Remember, all of this started, what was it, 1775? So Darnay tries to, I hope I got that right. I'll double check, but I think I'm right. Darnay tries to convince Mr. Lorry not to travel to Tellson's in France because it's a very dangerous place to be right now in this chapter. And Lorry insists he has to go. He doesn't feel like he's in danger. He works for Tellson's. He works for Tellson's in London. He works for Tellson's in France. And he wants to help secure things at the bank. And he says, oh, I'm going to bring Jerry, right? Oh, Jerry will help me. So Darnay in this chapter is very restless. He is a Frenchman by birth. We know that because of his conversation with his uncle, the Marquis, whose chateau was burned down, whose the uncle who ran over the young child and was murdered. So he's French by birth and an aristocrat by birth. He thinks that because he has renounced his legacy and sided with the common man, that somehow he might be able to help. He might be a bridge between the aristocrats and the commoners. During this interchange that they're having in this chapter, a letter is handed to Mr. Lorry, and I feel like this was pretty accessible to read. He's talking to Darnay, and Darnay notices the letter that was delivered, and it's addressed to the Marquis Saint Evremond. Wow, we find out that Dr. Manette made Charles vow not to share his name with anybody else. So what do we find out here? He is an Evremond. We already know who's the nephew of the Marquis, but this is his name. Darnay says, oh, I know that man. Nobody else knows where he is or how to find him. And Darnay says, I know that guy. What should he do at this point? Should he admit, hey, I'm Evremond, right? The letter is from Gabelle in France. He is the servant to the Evremond household. Take a note at how Darnay responded. He realizes that he did not tie up the loose ends at the chateau, the Evremond estate, when his uncle died, and he probably should have. Gabelle is accused of treason. So Gabelle, the servant of the home, you read the letter, he's begging for help. He is in the same boat as the other aristocrats, but he's not on the same par as an aristocrat. He was more of a servant, probably went around and collected taxes from the people who lived on the estate. Gabelle's accused of treason, and in the letter you find out that he's accused of helping people for the sake of an emigrant. Well, who left France? Who is an emigrant? They're not talking about the Marquis. He's left his earthly home. He's gone. We're talking about Charles Darnay, right? He's the emigrant. So Darnay left France to live in England. Okay, so Darnay is getting this letter. Please help. Can you connect that to the Lodestone Rock? How is Darnay drawn back to France? What does he want to do? He wants to go help Gabelle. He wants to go to France and help out. And Darnay says he knows the man. I'm sorry. I'm backed up with my notes. I'm sorry. I said 26 earlier. That's what's throwing me off. We're only going through 24. Apologize for that. Okay, so Darnay wants to go back to France, back to the Lodestone Rock. Well, what happened to the ship that was drawn to the rock? See if you can make a connection there. Okay, 19 through 24. Was that what you had to do? I think so. We're good. Okay, this was a lot shorter than the last two. You bring your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, your connections to class. We'll discuss this section, and then we'll dive into the third book. Book the third, the whole book is called The Track of the Storm. So you're still going to get that storm imagery happening. and Charles René is going to go back to France. And we're going to find out what is going to happen and how the rest of this story unfolds. I hope you're enjoying it. God bless. And I will see you in class on Thursday.